The night my mother-in-law called to remind me about the anniversary dinner she was throwing for my husband and me, I was standing in the parking garage of my firm at 9 p.m., still holding a deposition transcript I hadn't finished reviewing. She said she wanted it to be special. She said 40 is a milestone worth celebrating. She asked if I preferred the salmon or the beef tenderloin, and I told her salmon was fine, and she said wonderful, and we hung up and I sat in my car for 10 minutes before I could make myself drive home. That was 3 weeks before everything fell apart. My name is Vivian, not the one in the file, a different Vivian entirely. Though I sometimes wonder if there's a version of me that saw it coming sooner. I'm a corporate attorney. I've spent 15 years reading contracts the way other people read warning labels. Fast, thorough, looking for the line that will cost you everything if you miss it. I built my career on not missing things, which is why, when I finally understood what had been happening in my own home, the thing that hurt most wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the realization that I had been the easiest person in my husband's life to deceive, because I trusted him completely, and trust, I now know, can function exactly like a blindfold. My husband's name is Callum. We met in law school. He dropped out after the first year to pursue architecture, which he said was his real passion, and I believed him, because it was true. He was genuinely talented. When we married 8 years ago, he had just landed his first significant project, a boutique hotel renovation in Savannah. I remember thinking we were both finally at the beginning of something real. What I didn't know then, what I wouldn't know for 7 more years, was that Callum's career had quietly stalled. The Savannah project was good. The follow-up projects were smaller. By the time we were 5 years into our marriage, he was doing mostly residential additions and kitchen remodels, which he hated, which he never told me directly, which I only understood later when I read the text messages. The woman's name is Renata Voss. She is the founder and managing partner of Voss Capital Group, one of our firm's most significant clients. I handled her accounts personally. She is 51 years old, impeccably dressed, and the kind of woman who makes you feel slightly underprepared every time she walks into a room. I admired her. I had referred Callum to her 2 years prior because she was developing a mixed-use property in the West Loop and needed an architect with a certain aesthetic sensibility. I thought I was doing something good for both of them. I was, just not in the way I intended. The first thing I noticed was the calendar. Callum uses a shared Google Calendar. We set it up years ago to coordinate around my unpredictable hours. In January, I noticed he had started blocking off Tuesday afternoons as site visit, Voss project. This made sense. What didn't make sense was that the Voss project had been substantially completed since October. I know this because I had attended the ribbon cutting with Renata myself. I remember she gave a speech about vision and partnership, and Callum stood slightly behind me, and I remember thinking he looked proud. I didn't say anything about the calendar. I told myself I had misremembered the completion date. I told myself I was projecting stress onto nothing. I went back to work. In February, I had a closing dinner with a client at Oriole, a restaurant downtown that requires reservations months in advance. My client canceled at the last minute, and I was already dressed and already downtown, so I decided to walk a few blocks and try that Japanese whiskey bar my colleague had been recommending. It's a small place, dark wood, low lighting, the kind of bar where you don't need to talk loudly to be heard. Callum was at the bar. Renata was beside him. I want to be precise about what I saw, because I've replayed it enough times to be sure. They were not doing anything obviously incriminating. They were talking. His hand was on the bar near hers, not touching, but near. She was laughing at something he'd said, and he was looking at her the way he used to look at me when we were first together. Like she was interesting. Like she was surprising him. That look. I knew that look. I left before they saw me. I sat in my car outside and did not cry, which surprised me. I just felt very cold and very clear, the way I feel sometimes before a difficult cross-examination. I drove home. I poured a glass of water. I sat at the kitchen table, and I thought about what I actually knew versus what I suspected, and I thought about what I would need to know before I did anything at all. That night, I made a decision. I was not going to confront Callum. Not yet. Not until I understood the full picture. I had enough professional experience to know that confronting someone before you have complete information only gives them time to shape the narrative. I was not going to give Callum or Renata that opportunity. Over the next 6 weeks, I paid attention, not obsessively. I kept working, kept functioning, kept attending his mother's Sunday dinners, but carefully, methodically. I am, at my core, someone who builds cases. What I found was this. Callum had been meeting Renata approximately once a week for at least 8 months. I found this through the billing records at my own firm. Renata had requested and been granted a dedicated client liaison for ongoing strategic consultation. That liaison was supposed to be one of our junior associates, but the calendar notes I found in our shared system, access I had as a senior partner, showed that 3 of every 4 liaison meetings were attended by Callum, not our associate. Renata had specifically requested his presence. Our office had accommodated it. Nobody had told me. I want to pause here because this is the part that still takes my breath away when I think about it. It wasn't just Callum. It wasn't just Renata. My firm, my colleagues, people I had worked beside for a decade, had seen Renata Voss's architectural consultant attending internal client meetings with increasing regularity, and not one of them had thought to mention it to me. The partner who managed client hospitality had even expensed 2 dinners for Renata Voss and architectural team that included only Renata and Callum. I found this in the expense reports. It took me 40 minutes. Then there was the other thing. In March, I was reviewing a real estate acquisition agreement for a separate Voss Capital matter when I noticed a consulting fee line item that didn't correspond to any agreement I had drafted. $60,000, paid quarterly to a LLC called Bridgerton Design Consulting. I pulled the Illinois Secretary of State Business Registry. Bridgerton Design Consulting was registered to Callum Michael Hart, my husband. He had been receiving consulting payments from my client. Payments I had never been told about. Payments structured through an entity I didn't know existed. I sat with that for a long time. Then I called my personal attorney, not anyone from my firm, and I started talking. My mother-in-law, whose name is Dottie, had been planning the anniversary dinner for 2 months. She's an organized woman, efficient in the way that people who have managed other people's chaos for decades tend to be. She booked a private dining room at a restaurant in Lincoln Park. She sent a printed invitation, which I found charming and also, in retrospect, a little formal for what she actually intended the evening to be. I found out what she intended 2 weeks before the dinner. I was at her house for Sunday lunch. Callum had gone to find something in the garage, and Dottie and I were alone in the kitchen, and she was telling me about the seating arrangement, and she mentioned, almost casually, the way you mentioned that you've also invited the neighbors, that Renata would be attending, that Renata had become such an important part of Callum's professional life, and it seemed right to include her, and she hoped I wouldn't mind. I looked at my mother-in-law and I understood, completely and suddenly, that she knew. That she had known for some time that the anniversary dinner was not, in any meaningful sense, a celebration of my marriage. It was something else. An introduction, maybe. A formalization. A way of presenting a new arrangement to me in a setting where I would be expected to be gracious. She was watching my face while she said it, waiting. I told her the salmon sounded lovely. I drove home and called my attorney from the driveway. The dinner was on a Saturday in April. I wore a black dress, not because I was planning anything dramatic, but because I own a lot of black and I wasn't in the mood to think about color. Callum was quiet in the car. He had been quiet for weeks, actually, in a way that felt rehearsed, like he was conserving something. I had been quiet too, for different reasons. The private dining room was beautiful. Dottie has good taste. There were flowers on the table and candles and the kind of heavy linen napkins that you unfold slowly. Callum's father was there, a retired engineer named Walt, who has always been kind to me and who sat down and immediately started talking about the Cubs, which I suspect was a coping mechanism. Callum's sister was there, a woman named Brooke who was 3 years younger than Callum and has always treated me with the specific politeness of someone who has been told to be polite. And then Renata arrived, wearing something architectural in a dark green, and she kissed Dottie on both cheeks, and she shook my hand and said it was wonderful to finally celebrate properly. Finally, we sat down. There was wine. There were appetizers. Callum sat beside Renata rather than beside me, which might have been accidental or might not have been, and either way, nobody acknowledged it. The table talk was smooth and practiced. I watched my mother-in-law manage the room the way she manages everything, competently, confidently, just slightly controlling. She had an agenda for this dinner, and the agenda was moving along. About 40 minutes in, after the salads had been cleared, Dottie set down her wine glass and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as compassionate authority. She said she hoped I could understand that sometimes life takes unexpected turns. She said that Callum and Renata had developed a connection that was real and significant. She said she knew this was difficult, but that she hoped I was the kind of woman who could rise above her own pain for the sake of the people she loved. There it was. I looked at her. I looked at Callum, who was looking at the table. I looked at Renata, who was looking at me with something that might have been pity or might have been assessment. I couldn't tell which. I said, "I appreciate that, Dottie. I really do. I've actually been thinking about this situation quite a bit over the past few weeks." And then I reached into my bag and I took out 2 envelopes. The first one I placed in front of Callum. The second one I placed in the center of the table. Callum looked at the envelope. He picked it up. He opened it. Inside was a letter from my attorney, and behind it a copy of the divorce petition I had filed 4 days earlier. Also behind it, a 12-page summary of the financial discovery my attorney and I had prepared, which documented the consulting payments from Voss Capital to Bridgeton Design Consulting, along with a notation that Callum had, on 2 occasions, signed documents using a power of attorney that had expired 18 months prior. My attorney had flagged this. The state of Illinois takes expired powers of attorney seriously. The second envelope, the one in the center of the table, was addressed to Renata. It contained a letter from the firm's ethics board, which I had not written but which I had brought to their attention. The letter informed her that the firm would be conducting a review of her account and the consulting arrangements associated with it, and that she should expect to hear from our compliance team the following week. I had also, 2 days before the dinner, informed my firm's managing partner of everything I had found, not because I wanted to blow up the client relationship, I knew that would be costly, but because I had an ethical obligation to disclose a conflict that had been operating inside my own accounts without my knowledge. The managing partner had not been pleased with what the records showed. She was, however, very pleased with me for bringing it to her directly. The table was completely silent. Walt had stopped talking about the Cubs. Callum looked up from the papers and his face had gone through several expressions very quickly, and had arrived at something I didn't recognize. He said my name. I said I knew. He said he could explain. I said there wasn't really anything to explain, because I had the documentation, and I had been to see an attorney, and I wished him well, genuinely, and I hoped he would get the kind of architectural work he actually wanted, and I hoped Renata would enjoy managing the legal exposure that was coming her way without my firm's protection. Renata put the second envelope down without opening it. She looked at Dottie. Dottie looked at her hands. I folded my napkin, which was very nice linen, and I set it on the table, and I thanked Walt for always being decent to me because he had been. I said goodnight to Brooke. I looked at Dottie for a moment. I didn't say anything, and neither did she. And then I picked up my bag and I walked out of that dining room, through the restaurant, past the hostess stand, and out onto the sidewalk. It was a cold April night, the kind where you can see your breath. I had taken a car service so I wouldn't have to coordinate with Callum afterward. The driver was already outside. I got in. I asked him to take me home. In the weeks after, people asked me various versions of the same question. How did I hold it together so well? And I don't have a clean answer for that, because the truth is, I didn't always. There were nights in the middle of March when I sat on the bathroom floor and cried in a way I hadn't cried since my father died. There were mornings when I drove to work and then sat in the parking garage for 20 minutes before I could make myself go in. The composure at the dinner wasn't the whole story. It was just the part I chose to lead with. What carried me through, honestly, was the work. Not the legal strategy, though that helped, but the actual daily work of my job. The briefs that needed writing, the clients who needed answers, the associates who needed guidance. I am, at the end of the day, someone who finds structure stabilizing. I made lists. I met deadlines. I showed up. The divorce took 11 months. Illinois is an equitable distribution state, and Callum's attorney initially took the position that the consulting payments from Voss Capital were legitimate business income unrelated to our marital estate. My attorney disagreed at considerable length. We ultimately settled, and I am not going to detail the terms, but I will say that Callum is no longer in a position to use a power of attorney, expired or otherwise, on any document connected to my name. Renata's situation at the firm resolved in a manner I was not directly involved in. I recused myself entirely from anything related to Voss Capital once I disclosed the conflict. What I know is that the relationship between Voss Capital and our firm changed significantly, and that the consulting arrangement with Bridgeton Design Consulting was terminated. I heard through a colleague that Renata had retained her own outside counsel. I heard through a different colleague that Callum had moved into a rental in Wicker Park. I have not spoken to either of them since the dinner. Dottie called me once about 3 weeks after. She left a voicemail. She said she was sorry, not for what she had done, but for how it had affected me, which is not quite the same thing. But I listened to the message twice, and I decided I had enough clarity about my own life without needing more from her. I did not call back. Walt sent me a card at Christmas. It said simply, "I always thought you were good for him. I'm sorry he couldn't see it." I keep it in my desk drawer at work. Some days it's the thing I take out when I need to remember that kindness exists inside families, even when the family itself has failed you. I still practice law. I'm still at the same firm. I made equity partner 8 months ago. Something that had been in the pipeline before any of this happened, but that I want to be clear about because sometimes people assume the promotion was connected to my bringing the conflict disclosure forward. And I want to be clear that the timeline doesn't support that interpretation. I was already being evaluated. I already had the track record. I made partner because I am good at my job, and I had been good at it long before any of this fell apart. I'm 39 years old. I live alone in a condo in Lincoln Square that I kept in the settlement and that I have been slowly redecorating, room by room, mostly on weekends. I bought a rug last month that is completely impractical and exactly what I wanted, and there was nobody to consult about it. And that turned out to be a kind of freedom I didn't know I'd been missing. I'm not telling this story because I need you to be angry for me, though I understand if you are. I'm telling it because for a long time, I thought that being the smart one in the room meant I couldn't also be the one who got fooled. It took me a while to understand that those two things can both be true, and that the second one doesn't cancel out the first. I was deceived by my husband, by my client, by my mother-in-law, and by colleagues who chose not to see what was in front of them. All of that is true, also true. I found it. I documented it, I handled it, and I walked out of that dining room on my own 2 feet. The salmon, for the record, was not served. I left before the entrees arrived. I didn't miss it. I've thought a lot about the word exposure since that April night. People use it like it's a weapon. Like the point of telling the truth is to wound someone. But that's not what I was doing when I put those envelopes on that table. I wasn't there to perform. I wasn't there to make Callum cry in front of his mother or to humiliate Renata in front of people she'd carefully cultivated. I was there because I had done the work, and the work was finished, and it was time to close the file. That's the thing nobody tells you about being methodical when your life is falling apart. It doesn't feel heroic. It feels like survival. Every morning I drove to the office knowing what I knew and said nothing. I was making a choice, not to be passive, but to be precise. There is a difference, and it took me a long time to understand that choosing when to act is not the same as choosing not to act at all. Callum made choices too. Every Tuesday, he blocked off his calendar, every consulting payment that went into that LLC. Every night he came home and sat across from me at dinner and said nothing. Those were choices. And Dottie, planning her dinner, selecting the flowers, asking me about the salmon, she made choices. Renata, who shook my hand and said finally, like I was the last guest to arrive at a party I hadn't been invited to, she made choices. What I've come to understand is that the consequences of those choices didn't arrive because the universe was balancing a ledger. They arrived because I went looking for the truth and I found it, and then I decided what to do with it. That's not fate. That's just cause and effect, played out slowly over 8 months in conference rooms and billing records and a parking garage at 9 o'clock at night. I think about the version of me who didn't look at the calendar, who saw Callum and Renata at that bar and told herself she had imagined the way he looked at her. That version of me exists. I almost became her. She would have attended the anniversary dinner and sat through Dottie's speech and gone home with a version of her marriage that was already gone, just unacknowledged. That is also a choice, and I don't say that to judge anyone who has made it. I say it because I know how close I came. What carried me through wasn't anger. Anger burns fast and leaves you exhausted. What carried me through was something quieter, a commitment to understanding what was actually true, even when the truth was going to cost me something I thought I wanted to keep. That commitment is the closest thing I have to a personal philosophy. Know what's real. Do the work. Don't perform the outcome before you've earned it. I'm still a lawyer. I still show up. I bought a rug recently that is the wrong shade for the room, and I love it anyway, and there was nobody to tell me it was the wrong shade. And that turned out to matter less than I expected. I am 39 years old and I am, on balance, okay. Not because everything worked out neatly, it didn't entirely, but because I know who I am when things stop working out, and it turns out that person is someone I can live with. That's enough. For now, that is genuinely enough.